The Gilded Serpent. In the maritime city-state of Venenzia, young thief Aric steals the Serpent's Eye, a legendary emerald, from the powerful Valcourt family. He soon discovers it's the key to unlocking an ancient storm magic that once protected the city from invasions. Aric learns the Serpent's Eye is one of 3 artifacts needed to control the storm magic. The Valcourts have been secretly weakening the city's defenses to allow a foreign invasion they'll profit from. Aric forms an uneasy alliance with the rival Corvino family to find the other artifacts and stop the invasion. In a climactic battle, Aric and his allies must use the restored storm magic to repel the invaders and expose the Valcourts' treachery. Now the narration of the story. Aric's heart pounded as he raced through the halls of the Valcourt manor, the Serpent's Eye clutched tightly in his hand. The emerald's surface seemed to pulse with an inner light, as if it were alive. He could hear shouts and footsteps behind him. The guards had discovered the theft. He burst out onto a balcony, the cool night air hitting his face. The canals of Venenzia stretched out before him, a labyrinth of water and stone. He knew these streets like the back of his hand, but with the Valcourt's guards hot on his heels, his options were limited. Aric climbed onto the balcony railing, preparing to make the jump to the nearby rooftop. But before he could leap, a figure emerged from the shadows. He recognized her instantly, Lyra, the Corvino family's most skilled spy and assassin. "Going somewhere with that, thief?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. Aric's grip tightened on the emerald. "I didn't go through all this trouble just to hand it over to you." Lyra took a step closer, her eyes fixed on the Serpent's Eye. "You have no idea what you've stolen, do you? The true power it holds?" Behind them, the shouts of the guards grew louder. They were running out of time. Lyra held out her hand. "Give me the emerald, and I can help you escape. The Corvinos have no love for the Valcourts. We have a common enemy." Aric hesitated, torn between his instinct to run and his curiosity about the gem's true nature. The Serpent's Eye seemed to grow warm in his palm, as if urging him to make a decision. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, edging closer to the balcony's edge. "Because if the Valcourts catch you with that emerald, they'll kill you," Lyra said bluntly. "And because I know what it really is, a key to an ancient power that could change the fate of Venenzia." The guards were at the door now, pounding on the wood. Aric glanced back, then at Lyra. He had to make a choice. With a deep breath, he tossed the emerald to Lyra. She caught it deftly, a slight smile on her lips. "Wise decision," she said. "Now, follow me if you want to live." She leapt from the balcony, landing cat-like on the rooftop below. Aric followed, the shouts of the guards fading behind them as they raced across the rooftops of Venenzia, the Serpent's Eye glinting in the moonlight. And so began an unlikely alliance, a thief and an assassin united by a common goal and a mysterious gemstone that held the key to an ancient magic, and the fate of their city. Venenzia was doomed. He disappeared into the darkness, the wind whipping his hair into a frenzy as he ran. He needed to find a safe place to open the portal. But first, he had to warn the council. The palace of the ducal council stood tall on the hill that overlooked the city, the grandest building in all of Venenzia. Zephyr appeared at the window, startling one of the guards. "Who are you?" the guard demanded. "What are you doing here?" "My name is not important," Zephyr replied. "But I must speak to the council. It is a matter of great importance." The guard looked him up and down. He was dressed in dark gray and brown, and he moved with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. Zephyr guessed the guard decided he was not a threat, because he agreed to let Zephyr through. The council chambers were opulent. The walls were adorned in fine tapestries, the floor covered by a thick rug that muffled the sound of footsteps. The table in the center of the room was large, the chairs around it well cushioned and comfortable. "Come forward," said the leader of the council, Duchess Corvino. "I have news," Zephyr said. "The Serpent's Eye has been stolen." "From where?" Duchess Corvino asked. "The Valcourts," Zephyr replied. There was silence. "Then, what does that mean?" Lord Corvino finally asked. Zephyr hesitated. He did not want to scare the council, but he had no choice. They needed to know the truth. "It means our city is in danger," he replied. How can a jewel be a danger to our city? Duchess Corvino demanded. The serpent's eye is not a jewel. But he could not say that without telling them what it actually was. Why is this city in danger because of a jewel, Zephyr? Duchess Corvino pressed. Zephyr swallowed. Because it is not a jewel, he said. It is a key. What kind of key? Lord Corvino asked suspiciously. Zephyr took a deep breath. This was the part they would not believe. It is a key to a door between worlds, he said. The room fell silent. The council stared at Zephyr as if he was insane. That is quite enough, Duchess Corvino finally said. You may leave. Zephyr bowed, then disappeared back through the window from which he had come. He could feel the eyes of the guards on him as he walked away. They did not believe him, and now the city was doomed. Zephyr disappeared into the shadows, leaving the palace behind him. Now that he had tried to warn them, Zephyr knew he would have to flee the city. He could not risk being captured by the Valcourts when they discovered the truth of what their emerald meant. But there was one more thing he could do. One last chance for Zephyr to change his mind and try once again to warn the council before it was too late. He found the thief first. Aric had been the one to steal the serpent's eye, and he might still have some clue of where it had gone. And perhaps he could convince the thief to help him find the emerald and hide it once more. Aric was hiding in a small inn, the sign creaking in the wind above his head. Zephyr saw him through the window, eating a hearty dinner. He decided to go inside. Excuse me, he said, approaching Aric's table. Aric looked up at him. Who are you? My name is Zephyr, he replied. And yours? Why should I tell you? Aric asked. Because I know who you are, Zephyr said, his eyes on Aric. I know you stole the serpent's eye. Aric frowned. No, he said. Whoever you are, I am not the thief you seek. My name is Aric. And you are a very poor liar, Aric, Zephyr murmured. Will you help me? If we can find the emerald, there may still be time to save Venenzia. The thief sighed. You're going to have to explain what is going on, then, he said. Very well, Zephyr agreed. The serpent's eye truly is a jewel, but it is one with great power. It can open the door between worlds, and if it falls into the wrong hands, disaster will follow. How do you know so much about it? Aric asked. Are you a mage? I am the last of my kind, Zephyr replied sadly. Then you can open the portal, Aric said eagerly. Can't you just hide the emerald somewhere no one will ever think to look for it? Zephyr shook his head. If I opened the door, I could hide it in another world, he agreed. But then I would never be able to return here. It would be as though I never existed. Aric fell silent for a moment, deep in thought. He looked back up at Zephyr. I will help you, he finally said. But you have to answer one more question. How do you know all of this? Because I am a storm mage, Zephyr answered. It is why the emerald glows in my hands. The thief fell silent again. He seemed to be considering Zephyr's words. After a long moment, he nodded. Then we will find it, he said. I know who took it from me. The Corvino's assassin, Lyra. Then let us go to the Corvino's, Zephyr suggested. If she has the emerald, perhaps we can buy it from her. Aric shook his head. It would be a waste of money, he said. She is not the kind to take bribes. We will have to steal it back. Zephyr nodded. He had expected nothing else. The thief stood, and Zephyr followed him outside. The moon was full overhead as they made their way through the city to the Corvino manor. The wind howled in Zephyr's ears, the sound familiar and comforting. He felt more at peace now, with the thief beside him. Perhaps they had a chance after all. The Corvino manor was large and imposing, built on a hill that overlooked the city. Zephyr could see the canals from the top of it, the water glistening in the moonlight. He felt a pang in his heart. He was going to have to leave this place behind him. Zephyr looked down at his companion. Are you sure you want to do this, Aric? He asked. You could get caught, or even killed. I want to, Aric replied. My parents were scholars. I know the old magic still exists. They said there were others out there, waiting to return when we needed them again. I want to save the city. Zephyr looked at him. The thief's eyes shone in the light of the moon. He smiled. Let us go, he said. They disappeared into the night, ready to face whatever lay ahead of them. They snuck into the manor through a window on the third floor, where the sleeping rooms were. Zephyr used his magic to hold Aric up, and then followed him through the opening. The room they found themselves in was lavishly decorated, the bed covered with silk. Zephyr's eyes fell on a painting of a young woman dressed in red and blue. She was beautiful, but he could tell she was not an original. The artist had been talented, but this was not his best work. Aric frowned at him. What? He whispered. The painting, Zephyr said in a soft voice. It's a fake. Aric shrugged. Let's go. They left the room, creeping silently through the halls. Zephyr knew they would have to move fast. If they were discovered, they were dead. They turned a corner, and suddenly found themselves staring down at the cold metal of a blade. The assassin, Lyra. Zephyr felt his heart racing, his pulse pounding in his ears. We are not going to hurt you, Zephyr said softly. We only want the emerald. Lyra laughed, a cold sound. You think I would give it to you? No, Aric murmured. But we're asking anyway. She snorted. What is it about this emerald that you want it so badly? She asked. We need it to protect Venenzia, Zephyr explained. It can open the door to another world, and if our enemies get their hands on it, we will be destroyed. Lyra was silent for a moment. Then, how do you know that? She finally asked. Because I am a mage, Zephyr told her. Her eyes narrowed, and she lowered her blade. Very well, she said. Then we will give it back to you. Aric took the emerald from her hand, and then they fled the manor. It was a victory, but only a small one. There was still much to be done before they could be safe. Zephyr felt a warmth in his palm as he held the emerald. It was glowing again, a light pulsing beneath its surface. He realized then that it was more than just a key to the portal. The serpent's eye really was a powerful magic, one that only a mage could truly control. He held it tighter in his hand, the pulsing growing stronger. Zephyr realized then that he had made a mistake. He did not need to run to protect the city. He only needed to use the emerald's power. The storm magic swirled in his mind, begging to be released. Zephyr resisted its call with a shudder. He could not let it go. Not yet. He looked back at Aric and Lyra. We still need 2 more artifacts to unlock the full power of the serpent's eye, he told them. And what are those? Lyra asked. 2 keys, Zephyr answered. Then, before they could ask him how to find them, he continued. The emerald is a key, but it's only the first of 3. The keys must be brought together to unlock the door between worlds. Do you know who has them? Aric asked. No, Zephyr admitted. But there are rumors that they were split between the dukes of the city. And where are they now? Lyra pressed. Zephyr frowned. The dukes are gone, so I don't know, he answered. I do not even know if they are still in Venenzia. Aric fell silent, thinking. There may be a way to find out, he finally said. Zephyr raised an eyebrow. What is that? My parents were scholars, Aric repeated. They said that there were hidden libraries here in the city. The old mages knew that the council would turn on them someday, so they hid their books to keep them safe. And your parents found one of these libraries? Lyra asked, her brow furrowed. Not the library, Aric said. But they had a map, showing where it was located. It's in the Valcourt manor. Zephyr snorted. Do you think they will let us in there? No, Aric agreed. But Lyra is an assassin. We could sneak in. Lyra looked at him, and for a moment Zephyr thought she was going to argue. But then, she nodded. If we do this, then you have to help us with the keys, she told Zephyr. The Corvino family has no love for the Valcourts. Neither do the storm mages, Zephyr assured her. I will help you. Then we need to get the map, Lyra said, her voice determined. Zephyr nodded, feeling a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance to save the city. The Valcourt manor loomed above them, imposing and cold. Aric stood outside, Lyra and Zephyr at his side. They had come this far, but Zephyr was not sure they would make it much farther. They would have to go inside to find the map. If they were caught, they could all be killed. Zephyr knew what he had to do. He had been a coward long enough. Now was the time to take a stand. We need to go in, he told Aric and Lyra. We can't wait any longer. They will have missed the emerald by now, and they may already be searching for it. But we can't just walk in, Lyra protested. They will be guarding the doors. Even I could not get us past them. We don't need to walk through the door, Zephyr said. What do you mean? Aric asked, his brow furrowed. Are you going to use your magic to take us in? Zephyr smiled. Yes, he said. That's exactly what I'm going to do. The wind roared around them as Zephyr called on the magic. Lyra gasped as the air swirled around her, lifting her from the ground. They were flying. Hold on to me, Zephyr yelled over the roaring of the wind. I'm going to take us to the window. Lyra clutched at his jacket as they soared upwards, the wind buffeting them from side to side. Zephyr clung tighter to the emerald, the pulsing light glowing in his hand. He landed them on the windowsill with a thud, and they all tumbled to the floor. Zephyr caught his breath, looking around at the room they had found themselves in. It was a laboratory, full of strange machines that whirred and clicked. Zephyr had never seen anything like it before. He heard the others gasp behind him, and turned back to them. What is this place? Lyra asked. Her face was pale as she stared at the machines. This isn't alchemy. No, Zephyr agreed. He saw a glint of silver on one of the tables, and walked over to investigate. He picked it up, looking down at it. It was a key, with a symbol etched into the head that looked like a bird. This is one of them, he told Lyra and Aric, holding the key out for them to see. Where's the map? Lyra asked. Aric ran his hands along the shelves, pulling down books. It should be in one of these, he murmured. Then, here. He held out a map to the others. Zephyr studied it, then tucked the map into his pocket. Now let's get out of here, he said. But as they turned to the window, Zephyr realized they were too late. They could hear the guards shouting downstairs. Someone had found them. Lyra swore, pulling a dagger from her belt. Well, then we fight. Aric drew a sword, and Zephyr began to chant. The storm magic swirled up around him, pulsing with the power of the emerald in his hand. The door to the laboratory slammed open, and soldiers came storming in. Lyra dove at them with her dagger flashing in her hand. Aric followed, his sword slicing through the air. Zephyr watched them for a moment, then turned his attention to the soldiers that were heading for him. His eyes narrowed as he watched them. The emerald was growing hotter in his hand, its magic swirling around him like a shield. He reached out with it, feeling its power. The magic called to him, begging to be free. Zephyr clenched his fingers tighter around the emerald as a roar of wind burst forth. The soldiers were blown off their feet, sent tumbling backwards into the corridor beyond. Zephyr took advantage of the distraction to leap through the window. He landed on his feet, the emerald still pulsing in his hand. Zephyr turned to Lyra and Aric. We need to run, he said. Then he began to run, the others at his heels. Zephyr heard the roar of the soldiers behind them, the pound of boots on the pavement. He held the emerald tighter as he ran, feeling its magic swell up around him. They had to escape. They still needed one more key to unlock the door. And then they would need to find a way to defeat the Valcourts. They stopped running once they had left the manor behind them. Zephyr looked back at the others, watching their chests heave as they gasped for breath. What now? Aric finally asked. Zephyr held out the map. This is where we find the key, he said. And where are they now? Lyra pressed. Zephyr frowned. The dukes are gone, so I don't know, he answered. I do not even know if they are still in Venenzia. Aric fell silent, thinking. There may be a way to find out, he finally said. Zephyr raised an eyebrow. What is that? My parents were scholars, Aric repeated. They said that there were hidden libraries here in the city. The old mages knew that the council would turn on them someday, so they hid their books to keep them safe. And your parents found one of these libraries? Lyra asked, her brow furrowed. Not the library, Aric said. But they had a map, showing where it was located. It's in the Valcourt manor. Zephyr snorted. Do you think they will let us in there? No, Aric agreed. But Lyra is an assassin. We could sneak in. Lyra looked at him, and for a moment Zephyr thought she was going to argue. But then, she nodded. If we do this, then you have to help us with the keys, she told Zephyr. The Corvino family has no love for the Valcourts. Neither do the storm mages, Zephyr assured her. I will help you. Then we need to get the map, Lyra said, her voice determined. Zephyr nodded, feeling a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance to save the city. The Valcourt manor loomed above them, imposing and cold. Aric stood outside, Lyra and Zephyr at his side. They had come this far, but Zephyr was not sure they would make it much farther. They would have to go inside to find the map. If they were caught, they could all be killed. Zephyr knew what he had to do. He had been a coward long enough. Now was the time to take a stand. We need to go in, he told Aric and Lyra. We can't wait any longer. They will have missed the emerald by now, and they may already be searching for it. But we can't just walk in, Lyra protested. They will be guarding the doors. Even I could not get us past them. We don't need to walk through the door, Zephyr said. What do you mean? Aric asked, his brow furrowed. Are you going to use your magic to take us in? Zephyr smiled. Yes, he said. That's exactly what I'm going to do. The wind roared around them as Zephyr called on the magic. Lyra gasped as the air swirled around her, lifting her from the ground. They were flying. Hold on to me, Zephyr yelled over the roaring of the wind. I'm going to take us to the window. Lyra clutched at his jacket as they soared upwards, the wind buffeting them from side to side. Zephyr clung tighter to the emerald, the pulsing light glowing in his hand. He landed them on the windowsill with a thud, and they all tumbled to the floor. Zephyr caught his breath, looking around at the room they had found themselves in. It was a laboratory, full of strange machines that whirred and clicked. Zephyr had never seen anything like it before. He heard the others gasp behind him, and turned back to them. What is this place? Lyra asked. Her face was pale as she stared at the machines. This isn't alchemy. No, Zephyr agreed. He saw a glint of silver on one of the tables, and walked over to investigate. He picked it up, looking down at it. It was a key, with a symbol etched into the head that looked like a bird. This is one of them, he told Lyra and Aric, holding the key out for them to see. Where's the map? Lyra asked. Aric ran his hands along the shelves, pulling down books. It should be in one of these, he murmured. Then, here. He held out a map to the others. Zephyr studied it, then tucked the map into his pocket. Now let's get out of here, he said. But as they turned to the window, Zephyr realized they were too late. They could hear the guards shouting downstairs. Someone had found them. Lyra swore, pulling a dagger from her belt. Well, then we fight. Aric drew a sword, and Zephyr began to chant. The storm magic swirled up around him, pulsing with the power of the emerald in his hand. The door to the laboratory slammed open, and soldiers came storming in. Lyra dove at them with her dagger flashing in her hand. Aric followed, his sword slicing through the air. Zephyr watched them for a moment, then turned his attention to the soldiers that were heading for him. His eyes narrowed as he watched them. The emerald was growing hotter in his hand, its magic swirling around him like a shield. He reached out with it, feeling its power. The magic called to him, begging to be free. Zephyr clenched his fingers tighter around the emerald as a roar of wind burst forth. The soldiers were blown off their feet, sent tumbling backwards into the corridor beyond. Zephyr took advantage of the distraction to leap through the window. He landed on his feet, the emerald still pulsing in his hand. Zephyr turned to Lyra and Aric. "We need to run," he said. Then he began to run, the others at his heels. Zephyr heard the roar of the soldiers behind them, the pound of boots on the pavement. He held the emerald tighter as he ran, feeling its magic swell up around him. They had to escape. They still needed one more key to unlock the door. And then they would need to find a way to defeat the Valcourts. They stopped running once they had left the manor behind them. Zephyr looked back at the others, watching their chests heave as they gasped for breath. "What now?" Aric finally asked. Zephyr held out the map. "This is where we find the key," he said. Aric studied the map, then looked back up at the others. "I know this place," he said. "It's the old lighthouse." "Then that's where we go," Lyra told him. "Let's get going." The others nodded, and they began to make their way towards the sea. Zephyr walked with them, his mind on the Valcourts. There was more at play here than just thieves and mages. He knew it. Zephyr would have to confront them eventually, but for now, they had to find the keys. They reached the lighthouse by nightfall, the moon rising overhead as they climbed the steep path to its door. The light was dark inside, but the air was thick with magic. Zephyr could feel it all around him, swirling in the air. He began to chant, the storm magic swelling up from his soul. A door hidden in the walls of the lighthouse slid open, revealing a chamber within. Zephyr stepped inside, the others following him. He heard the door slam shut behind them, and turned to face whatever was coming for them. The chamber was small, the walls covered in a thick layer of dust. But what drew Zephyr's attention was not the room. It was the being that waited for them within. It was tall and thin, its body made of a gleaming white stone. Its face was blank, no eyes or mouth visible on its surface. Zephyr stared at it, feeling fear creep into his heart. "What are you?" he asked aloud. "I am a golem," the being answered in a cold voice. "And I guard the key." "How do we get it?" Lyra asked. "You must answer my riddle," the golem told her. "If you answer correctly, then the key is yours." Aric stepped forward. "Then we accept your challenge." The golem nodded its head. "Then here is the riddle," it said. "What can be broken, but never held?" Aric thought for a moment. "A promise," he finally answered. The golem was silent. Then, to Zephyr's amazement, it spoke. "That is correct," it said. Then it reached into its chest and pulled out a small key. It handed it to Zephyr, then stepped back to the wall. The chamber began to shake, and then the walls were gone. Zephyr blinked in the sudden light. They were back outside the lighthouse. But they were not alone. Lord Damien Valcourt stood before them, a cruel smile on his face. "You should not have bothered trying to escape," he sneered. "My men have captured your families, and they will pay the price for your betrayal." Zephyr drew back, rage burning in his chest. How could the Valcourts be so ruthless? He began to chant, his voice rising in a fury of storm magic. A blast of wind struck out at Damien, knocking him off his feet. Zephyr leaped forward, the emerald burning in his hand. They had to defeat Damien before they could use the keys. If the Valcourts controlled the keys, then all was lost. Zephyr raised the emerald to Damien's throat, feeling the power of the storm magic coursing through his veins. He was not going to lose. Zephyr tightened his grip on the emerald. Then he brought it down on Damien's neck. Blood spurted up as Damien's head fell to the ground. Zephyr stared down at him, feeling horror flood his heart. He had just killed a man. He was no better than the Valcourts he had just defeated. Lyra's hand fell on his shoulder. "Don't," she murmured. He was evil. He got what he deserved. Zephyr swallowed, feeling shame flood his soul. Lyra was right. He had done what needed to be done, even if he did not like it. Zephyr turned back to her and Aric, seeing the blood on their faces. They had all fought the Valcourts, and they had all won. "What now?" Aric asked. "We've got the keys. What are we going to do with them?" "We go to the library," Zephyr said. "And there, we open the door." They walked down the hill towards the docks, the keys clinking together in Zephyr's hand. Lyra walked at his side, Aric following behind them. They boarded a small boat, and then Zephyr began to row. He glanced up at the moon, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. They were safe. Venenzia was safe. The boat bumped against the shore of the island they had come to, and Zephyr stood. He jumped out of the boat onto the beach, landing on the wet sand. The others followed him, Lyra glancing back at the city behind them. They made their way into the trees, and soon came to a building. Zephyr pushed open the door, then stepped inside. Aric and Lyra followed him, their eyes scanning the shelves of books. "What are we looking for?" Lyra murmured. "The third key," Zephyr answered. Then he saw it, nestled among the books on a high shelf. He stretched up, and then pulled it down. Zephyr handed it to Aric. "This is the last one," he said. "Now what?" Lyra asked. Zephyr walked to the wall, pushing aside a tapestry to reveal a door. He inserted one of the keys into a hole, and then heard a click as the door swung open. He stepped through the doorway, the others following him. They found themselves in a wide chamber, books piled high around them. Zephyr led them to another door on the far side, and then inserted the second key. The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase, winding down into the darkness. Zephyr began the descent, his heart pounding in his chest. They were almost there. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and then Zephyr saw it. The serpent's eye glowed on a pedestal, pulsing with ancient magic. This was what he had been searching for. This was the heart of Venenzian power. Zephyr reached out, and then took up the serpent's eye in his hand. It was warm against his skin, its pulsing growing faster as he felt the storm magic swirl up around him. He felt a presence behind him, and then turned to see a mage. He wore a long robe, a hood hiding his face in shadow. Zephyr felt a jolt of surprise, and then stared at the mage. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am an ancient mage," the mage answered. "I was trapped here until the keys were returned. How can I trust you?" Zephyr asked. He clutched the serpent's eye tighter in his hand. "Because I want the same things you do," the mage answered. Zephyr thought for a moment. Could he trust this mage? But he had no choice. He needed help to defeat the Valcourts. He held out the serpent's eye. "What do I do now?" he asked the mage. The mage took the emerald from him, then placed it in a small indentation on the wall. A rumbling sound filled the room, and then a door opened behind the mage. Zephyr followed him through it, his heart pounding with excitement. They found themselves on the deck of a ship, the wind blowing into Zephyr's face. He looked up at the sky, and saw the clouds swirling above them. The storm magic was building. He could feel it. "Now we wait," the mage said. Zephyr waited, watching the sky for a sign. And then it came. The clouds split apart as the first drops of rain fell from above. Zephyr smiled. The storm was coming. And it would save Venenzia. He was sure of it. The ships came the next day. Zephyr and the mage watched them from the deck of the ship, their sails fluttering in the rising wind. Zephyr held the serpent's eye, feeling the storm magic swirling up around it. The sky darkened overhead, the clouds boiling upwards into towering clouds of rain and wind. The storm was almost ready. The enemy ships began to fire on the city below, their cannons booming out across the water. Zephyr flinched as he watched the shells explode into buildings below. Venenzia was being destroyed. He clenched his fist around the serpent's eye. He had to act now. He had no choice. Zephyr raised the serpent's eye to the sky, feeling the magic surge up from his core. He began to chant. The wind howled around him as he spoke, the ship rocking under his feet. The other ships drew closer to the shore, preparing to land. Zephyr shouted the final words of the spell, and then a bolt of lightning tore through the sky. It struck the largest of the ships, sending it up in flames. The other ships began to back away from the city. But Zephyr was not finished. He began another chant, this one for wind. The air swirled up into a funnel, striking out at the fleeing ships. They were blown away from Venenzia, back to their home country. The storm began to clear, the rain slowing to a sprinkle. Zephyr dropped the serpent's eye back into his pocket, and then turned away from the sea. Venenzia had been saved. And he had done it. He made his way down to the city, finding Lyra and Aric in the streets. They were fighting off soldiers, and Zephyr drew his dagger to help them. The storm had weakened the Valcourts. Zephyr knew he could beat them now. Aric caught sight of him first, and then grinned. "Welcome back," he said. Lyra smiled. "I take it the storm worked." Zephyr nodded. "It did," he said. They kept fighting as the storm slowly faded away. Finally, they found themselves back at the Corvino manor. The Duchess met them on the steps, a smile on her face. "Well done," she said. Zephyr smiled back. He felt proud of what he had done. He had saved the city. He had defeated his enemies. They entered the house, and then began to eat. Zephyr sat with his friends, watching them laugh and chat around him. He smiled at Lyra across the table, and then Aric nudged him with his elbow. "Are we going to get back together?" he asked. "We make a good team." Zephyr grinned. "We do," he agreed. "But we still have work to do." Then they all fell silent. They knew what Zephyr meant. The Valcourts may have been defeated, but Zephyr still had a score to settle with them. He had to make them pay for what they had done. They left the manor the next morning, Zephyr with a heavy pack slung over his shoulder. Lyra walked by his side, her hand on the hilt of her dagger. "What's the plan?" she asked as they walked. "We go back to our own homes," Zephyr answered. "Then we plan." Lyra nodded. "I'm not done fighting yet," she said. Then they fell silent as they continued on. Zephyr glanced back once at the city, his heart full of pride. He had saved it. He had defeated its enemies. And he knew he would do it all again. "Thanks for helping me," he told Lyra. She smiled up at him. "Anytime," she said. They came to Zephyr's home, and he nodded to Lyra. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. She nodded, then turned and walked away. Zephyr entered his house, pulling off his cloak and dropping his pack on the floor. He walked into the kitchen, looking out the window at the sea. It was calm today, the sun shining down on the waves. Zephyr sighed, then walked to a cabinet and opened the door. He pulled out a book, then began to flip through its pages. There were spells within. Ancient Venenzian magic. Zephyr had used it to defeat the Valcourts once. He would do it again. He began to read, his lips moving as he chanted. The storm magic surged up around him, his heart beating in rhythm with the wind. He would get revenge on the Valcourts. Oh, yes. He would. Zephyr's eyes narrowed as he read the next words in the book. He knew what he was going to do. And there was nothing the Valcourts could do to stop him. He grinned as he finished the spell. The storm magic swirled up around him, pulsing with ancient power. The Valcourts were going to pay for their treachery. He would make sure of that. He left the house then, walking out into the bright sunshine. The breeze blew off the sea, and Zephyr grinned up at the sky. The storm was coming again. And this time, it was not going away. He had made sure of that. The storm would bring chaos to the city. It would bring war. And in the end, only one family would rule Venenzia. The Corvino family. And Zephyr would be their new storm mage. They would control the city now, and no one would ever try to betray them again. Zephyr grinned again as he walked, feeling pride surge through him. He had done it. He had finally achieved his dream. And now, it was time to celebrate. He found his friends on the beach, laughing and talking together. Zephyr joined them, letting out a whoop of joy. He felt free now. Free at last. They began to dance on the beach, their feet kicking up sand as the wind blew out to sea. Zephyr laughed out loud, feeling happy at last. He had done it. He was finally free. And nothing would ever change that. Not again. The sun began to set, casting golden light out over the ocean. Zephyr watched it set, feeling peace settle over him. It was finally over. Venenzia could be at peace at last. The storm would protect it. He had made it so. And in the end, it would be just the Corvino family standing. They would be the ones to rule the city. Zephyr grinned, feeling power surge up through him. It had finally happened. And now, he could live at last. Free at last. He let out a shout of triumph, and then danced again into the waves. His friends were laughing with him, and Zephyr felt his heart soar up into the sky. He had done it at last. He had finally achieved everything he had always wanted. He had achieved his dreams. And now, nothing could ever take that away from him. Nothing at all. Zephyr let out a final shout of joy, and then the waves washed over him as the sun disappeared into the sea. He was free. He was finally free. And he knew he would always be. Always. Always. Always.